Good afternoon, my friends. This is Paul, and today I'm going to be reviewing to you Apollo Justice Ace Attorney Trilogy for the Nintendo Switch. This is a collection of 3 games in the Ace Attorney franchise: Apollo Justice Ace Attorney, originally released for the DS, Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney Dual Destinies, originally released for the 3DS, and Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney Spirit of Justice, also on the Nintendo 3DS. You can play the chapters in any order, and you can even select which part of which chapter you want to play to really customize your experience, especially as Dual Destinies in particular is presented outside of chronological order. You also get most of the DLC that was included with the 3DS games, including all of the costumes and the 2 full-length special episodes. Sadly, they didn't include the Asinine Attorney special cases from Spirit of Justice, and you also can't mix and match costumes between games. But it is nice that most of the greatness of these games is preserved, especially if you get the physical version. Before we get into the games themselves, I'd like to talk about some of the extra features this collection has to offer. My favorite has to be the Orchestra Hall, by far, because you know I love orchestra music. This allows you to listen to all of the soundtracks of all 3 games, as well as 2 exclusive music pieces made just for this trilogy, and finally, some selections from some of the Ace Attorney Orchestra concerts, which some of them don't even have to do with the games in the trilogy. It's just such a cool bonus. And you even get little chibi characters playing around in the background. They'll stop playing and get annoyed with you if you press the pause button, and sometimes other characters will walk by if you stop on the orchestra screen long enough. The art museum lets you view concept art, backgrounds, and character illustrations, as well as watch all of the cutscenes. You also get special artwork pieces if you manage to complete the games without using story mode. There's one for each individual game, and then there's one for doing all 3 games without story mode. One of the coolest things about watching the cutscenes is that you even get the Spirit of Justice prologue anime as a bonus, complete with an English dub and all. It is really nice to get a chance to hear these characters speaking in full sentences, because the cutscenes in the 3DS games are way too short, and most of the dialogue you hear from these characters are just the objections and hold-its that are customary in most Ace Attorney games. The animation studio allows you to interact with the various models of the games and get to view all of their poses and all of the things that they shout out. And then finally there's accolades, which are this game's achievements, which don't really do anything besides bragging rights. But one thing to keep in mind is that if you use story mode, you might not be able to get all of these achievements. Most of these games don't have too many changes made to them because Capcom openly said that they wanted to preserve the original games as much as possible. So most of the things I'm going to mention as changes here are pretty minor. All of the games now have Rumble support for the first time ever. Every game has 10 save files, and there's also an autosave for each one. The games now have a story mode option that lets them play themselves if you get too stuck, although again, keep in mind you won't be able to get all of the achievements and all of the artwork pieces if you use this too much. What's cool about story mode is that you can turn it on and off whenever you want. So, for instance, if, say, you're having trouble finding the right testimony, but you still want to know what evidence to use, you can go ahead and use story mode. In the 3DS games, they have consulting, which was already in the original games, but you couldn't turn it off, similar to how you couldn't turn off the tutorial pig in Donkey Kong Country Returns. So in this version, you have the option to turn consulting off if you don't want the game to treat you like you're an idiot. Apollo Justice in particular has a handful of tweaks to make it ever so slightly closer to the 3DS game, since it's the one game on the DS. Some of the UI has been changed during the investigation so that it plays more like the investigations in those games, such as having the hand cursor that flashes red when you're at an interactable area and then has a check mark next to it after you've finished investigating, and the icons for moving, presenting, examining, and talking are all in line with the 3DS games. All 3 games have the 5-hit penalty system instead of having the ridiculously long health bar in the first two games, so that it's more in line with Spirit of Justice. And Apollo Justice finally has the option to review the text that came before, just in case you weren't paying attention. So sort of speed things up, let's talk about what all three games have in common before we talk about each individual game separately. In all three games, you play as a lawyer who obviously listens to witnesses testify in the courtroom, and as you're listening, you can press the witnesses to ask for more information. Sometimes pressing can give you new testimony or new evidence, and sometimes the judge will ask you an additional question. And once you look through your court record and find the evidence that contradicts the witness's testimony, you'll present it with a very satisfying objection scream, as well as a nice splash screen option. And then the music will get all dramatic, and the witnesses will be all flustered, and it is very much not an average courtroom simulator. Oftentimes the witnesses are extremely over the top and goofy, and the rules of actual courtroom proceedings are very rarely actually followed. There's quite a lot that the characters get away with that you would never see in an actual trial. But that's what makes Ace Attorney so fun, is that it's not realistic, and it makes you want to be a lawyer while simultaneously realizing that being a lawyer is actually quite boring. A lot of times these cases have some of the best writing I've ever seen in a visual novel, but one particular downside that all three games suffer from is that they are extremely linear to a fault, and that means that you have to play the game at exactly the pace that the developers intended. So if you figure out the answer before the protagonist, you'll have to play at his or her speed. Additionally, I encountered a few instances where I knew what I was supposed to be saying, but I didn't know how to say it with the evidence that I had. So there were quite a few times where I lost points because I didn't present my case exactly how the game wanted it to. Instances such as when you have to present a photo of the murder weapon as opposed to the murder weapon itself are some of the most egregious, but at the end of the day, after you get past these little nuisances, you go back to loving almost every minute of it, because Ace Attorney games are, for the most part, really well written, and some of the twists just completely switch your thinking around in really clever ways. The investigations are where the games kind of fall apart, though. You move the cursor around like an old PC game and click on areas of interest. Sometimes you'll gain new evidence because you'll find something on the screen, or you'll talk to characters and interrogate them about the case. And I have never really liked these that much, as I feel like a lot of times there's not enough direction on where you're supposed to go. Like sometimes if you miss one little thing, then the game is just going to soft lock you for no reason at all. The 3DS games are significantly better in this regard, but I still often tell myself, I wish I could just get back to the courtroom, just have it entirely take place in the court and forget all of the investigations. But at the very least, the addition of the check mark next to items that you've already investigated does help Apollo Justice to be ever so slightly more bearable. Apollo Justice is the fourth mainline game in the Ace Attorney trilogy, and also the only one in this collection that's on the DS. So graphically it may look kind of inferior to the other games in this collection, but thankfully Capcom has done a pretty good job of both preserving the original game while also making sure that it looks good on modern hardware. It fits the entire screen, which is more than what the Ghost Trick remaster can do. And now the sound and music are no longer compressed, so you can actually hear what the game was supposed to sound like, as opposed to the DS making everything sound like it was crunched. I remember hating this game when I first reviewed it, and while I still think it's the worst Ace Attorney, I don't think it's as bad as I used to think. Sure, it still has some of the worst writing in the series, and the way that they treated Phoenix was really terrible. I feel like he could have been any other character and it would have worked great, but the fact that it's Phoenix sort of makes it feel like he just does not fit the writing. That's just not something Phoenix would say. And I get it, it's several years after Trials and Tribulations, so of course people are gonna get older and mature, but there's a difference between being mature versus being a completely different personality. Thankfully, the later games seem to fix this, and if you look at Apollo Justice in context with the two games that came after it, then it does make it slightly easier to play. But the problem is that the writing is just generally kind of either inconsistent, cringy, or brings up a plot point but never elaborates on it. There's a lot of things that are left up for interpretation, and some explanations just either make no sense or are only half explained. That being said, I do like Apollo Justice significantly more now than when I first played it, as I really like the forensic mini games that you do during the investigations. In the original DS version, they made good use of the touchscreen and the microphone. And while some players may be sad that you obviously can't do the microphone stuff anymore and it's relegated to buttons, I personally think it's a change for the better, as the older I get, the harder it is for me to exhale, so being able to just press a button to blow away fingerprint powder is much appreciated. I also think the writing is a lot better than I originally gave it credit for. Sure, it's significantly weaker than the rest of the games in the series, but at the same time, it manages to crack some really funny jokes, a lot of which I screen captured on my Switch, and there are times when the game does seem like it's a really complex plot that weaves between various points in the timeline, and at some points I felt like, dang, that is actually a really fascinating narrative. So while it may be inconsistent, it's still a joy to play. It's still got the basic Ace Attorney gameplay, so it's still fun. It's just the weakest one in the series. But again, because this is a trilogy, it helps that you know what this is leading up to and what it's setting up, and for that, I respect it, even if I don't think it's a mind-blowing entry. I know it seems like I've been doing nothing but harping on Apollo Justice, but it's mainly only the story and characterizations that I really have too much fault with. On the gameplay side, Apollo Justice is quite solid. It still features the same amazing courtroom dynamics that the series is known for, and it included a few new features to take advantage of the extra power of the DS. Apollo has the ability to perceive nervous habits that the witnesses have. Thankfully, the game will tell you when there is a testimony where you can put this to use, and then you'll zoom in on the witness, and the statement will be said really slowly. So if you can see, like, say, a twitch or a moving hand, then you can perceive that and try to present a piece of evidence that explains what's going on. Returning from Rise from the Ashes, the bonus case in the first Ace Attorney is the ability to rotate evidence. While I think this is somewhat underutilized, it is really cool to see the extra ability of the DS to perceive 3D. Speaking of which, one final cool gameplay addition is the ability to have 3D crime scene recreations. These occur way too infrequently, but it does make some of the crazier cases much easier to visualize, and therefore spot the contradictions a lot easier. Generally speaking, I think the high points of Apollo Justice are cases 1 and 4. The first case featuring some of the coolest surprises I've ever seen in the series, and the final case, while some of its storytelling does feel a bit hit or miss, does have a really cool flow to it without spoiling too much. Unfortunately, in the context of a trilogy, it is slightly harder to play Apollo Justice than it is the other games because it lacks some of the quality of life improvements. So for example, you don't have the notebook to help you along on the investigations, which can make them feel like they are less intuitive than the ones in the 3DS game. You also don't have the pop-up menu that allows you to just go to any location at all. Sometimes you have to manually walk from location to location, and then there's the fact that there's also no consult option. So if you're having trouble in a cross-examination, you're probably just going to have to resort to story mode or really paying attention to the hints that the characters give. Apollo Justice is a fun game. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. It's just that its story and characterization leave something to be desired in the context of the rest of the Ace Attorney series, and even Professor Layton versus Phoenix Wright for that matter. But if you can look past that, it's a fun courtroom simulator with some amazing jokes, a lot of fun, and knowing that it's part of a trilogy, it is amazing to see how Apollo may not have been the greatest attorney starting forward, but as the series progresses, he really develops into quite the competent character who stands on his own and isn't just Phoenix but looking different and has a few additional quirks. Dual Destinies was the first mainline Ace Attorney game to be released on the 3DS, if you don't count Professor Layton vs. Phoenix Wright, and while I do think that game did a better job of showcasing what the 3DS was capable of, Dual Destinies is still a very impressive technical showcase. The characters are now full 3D models as opposed to just being cardboard cutouts, so their animations are much more advanced. Sure, they don't breathe like they do in Professor Layton vs. Phoenix Wright, but they still feel like their animations flow a lot better, and they're not just rapidly shifting to something else all of a sudden. There are more dynamic camera angles, there are full anime-esque cutscenes. I'm not the biggest fan of these cutscenes because I don't really like anime, and some of the voice acting is pretty cringeworthy. But what's more important than sheer horsepower is that Dual Destinies also refines the formula in a way that it makes it more accessible to newbies while still preserving the challenge of the main series. The courtroom is more or less the same as ever, but the investigations have seen a huge overhaul. There's now a notebook that helps you keep track of where you need to go and what you need to present, so that really streamlines things. And even if the notebook wasn't good enough, oftentimes the characters will flat out say, here's where we should go next, and sometimes the game just gives up and takes you to the next location automatically without any player input. You can also rotate the crime scenes in full 360-degree angles, which really makes the crime scenes look very impressive because of the added 3D element instead of the 2D backdrops of Apollo Justice. The main new gimmick in Dual Destinies is that you keep switching perspectives between 3 different lawyers, and each lawyer, whether you are controlling that lawyer or he or she is your assistant in the courtroom, can use a special ability to separate that character. You've got Phoenix Wright, who is back to actual Phoenix Wright, like he feels like he's older, but at the same time he's the Phoenix that we all know and love. Anyway, he has the Magatama, which allows him to perceive when characters have Psyche-Locks, which means that they're hiding secrets. And so it's essentially a way that he can present evidence to counter characters' statements outside of the courtroom. If only that was used in the courtroom, that would be very interesting and help him spot the liars much more quickly. I never really liked these Psyche-Locks in the original Ace Attorney series, but they've seen a dramatic improvement in Dual Destinies. For starters, the game will automatically have all of the evidence that you need, so no more guessing if you literally have no answer and you need to go to somewhere else to find the right evidence to refute the statements. Second, you don't lose any health when you present the wrong evidence, so you don't need to worry about having less hit points when you go into the trials as you would have in the old games. Apollo has his bracelet to perceive, which plays out pretty much exactly the same as it did in Apollo Justice, even down to the music being recycled, although it has seen a slight improvement. You don't really use it in the courtroom very much anymore. You typically use it in the investigations, which helps things flow more smoothly. But then we have the newcomer, Athena Sykes. In addition to being another peppy female assistant, she has the ability to use the mood matrix, which essentially allows her to view the emotions of the person testifying. And so your job will be to point out an emotion that feels like it shouldn't be there. So for example, you might be like, oh, I'm so sad, but then the character will be exhibiting joy. And so you'll be like, why are you happy when you're saying that you're sad? And so it's a great way to freshen up the courtroom gameplay, and it ties in really nicely with the game's story as well. Even though I've played all 3 of the games in this collection before, the Mood Matrix was still kind of hard for me because I made 2 critical mistakes. The first is that I'm not very empathetic, so emotions are a bit harder for me to figure out than for most people, so I got stuck on quite a lot of the puzzles because I was like, it seems like all of these emotions are inconsistent. But the other mistake I made is that I didn't know that if you go through the whole testimony and loop back to the beginning, your character will give you hints as to what you should be looking for. And that definitely helped when I went into Spirit of Justice. I love the way the mood matrix was handled, and I really like Athena as a character as well. When you first meet her, she seems like she's yet another energetic female lead, like the replacement of Maya Fey. But then as the story progresses, you realize that she actually has quite a lot of difference and quite the amazing character development. For that matter, the story as a whole is dramatically improved throughout Dual Destinies. It feels like a proper apology to all of the missteps that Apollo Justice did, while at the same time not completely shafting it. Apollo as a character has a fantastic amount of development, and while Phoenix may be the namesake of this game, this really does feel like Apollo's game, because he does a great job of separating himself from Phoenix in the way that he approaches his reasoning, and he also has like his own convictions about how things should be done, hence the title of the game, and it really helps him stand out more and feel like he's really taken the time to improve as a lawyer since the first game. The cases are better written, the writing is much better, there's not as many plot holes and leaving things up to the imagination. Phoenix is back to his old self while still feeling like he's gotten older. And overall, Dual Destinies is such a huge improvement. Spirit of Justice uses the same engine as Dual Destinies and pretty much all of the major gameplay mechanics, so the way that it separates itself from the previous entry is the fact that you are switching back and forth between two entire countries with completely different approaches to the legal system. When you're playing as Phoenix, you're in the country of Khura'in, and there he enters the Hall of Justice, which is a courtroom where they despise lawyers with a passion, so much so that if the client is found guilty, so is the lawyer, and the lawyer receives the same punishment, because in their logic, if you're abetting a criminal, then you're considered an accomplice. And boy, do you feel the hostility right away. The music is much more ominous, the characters are throwing even more insults at Phoenix than usual, and there's a lot of other little effects, such as chimes and incense, to make it feel like this Hall of Justice really separates itself. In fact, there are even some UI and special effect changes compared to the regular court that really help set it apart, such as when you win a case, there will be butterflies flying around instead of the usual confetti, or when you go into a cross-examination, there will be characters in another language above where it says cross-examination in English to really set it apart. One of the defining features of the Hall of Justice is that they have divination seances. Now, for those of you that are Catholic, you might be a bit worried that this game deals much more with the occult than Dual Destinies does. And my quick response to that, because I do have a Spirit of Justice Catholic review, is that video games are classified as interactive media, and so therefore the church leaves it up to the individual's conscience and whether or not the game is actually causing you to fall into sin. So the way I see it is the divination seances are a great gameplay mechanic, and if it were called by another name, such as virtual reality or Phoenix putting on a special pair of glasses that let him see from the victim's perspective, then no one would complain. So that's how I see it. Anyway, the divination seances allow you to view a full 3D movie of the victim's final moments, and your job is to point out if there's an inconsistent sensation that doesn't make sense with what the High Priestess is interpreting. And so this will cause the High Priestess Rayfa to refine her insights. And so there's a constant working together of her interpreting what she believes is going on with the victim, and Phoenix's job is to say, well, this doesn't make sense with the evidence, or why is this sensation here? It doesn't make any sense. Of course, when you're playing as Apollo or Athena, it's back in the regular courtroom with the much nicer judge and less hostile atmosphere, and I think the reason the game did this was, one, to make sure that Apollo had even more character development, and two, so that it has some comic relief. These trials are generally a lot more lighthearted, feel more like traditional Ace Attorney trials, and I think it's to break up the intensity that the Phoenix trials have. The investigations are pretty much the same as they were in Dual Destinies, with one major addition. Emma Skye returns as a detective, And the game seems to do a lot of damage control because a lot of players didn't like how she was portrayed in Apollo Justice, so now she's still obsessed with science, but not nearly as grumpy as she used to be. And she allows you to do some of those forensic mini games that were so much fun in Apollo Justice. Unfortunately, I feel like the minigames aren't nearly as much fun as they are here, and were actually some of my least favorite moments in Spirit of Justice. It's much slower to put out the fingerprint powder, and it's much harder to figure out where you're supposed to dust because you fully rotate the object that you're dusting, and it feels like it just takes too long, and the music gets on my nerves because it's really hip-hoppy and upbeat, which is not typically my style. And at one point I just turned on the story mode because I was like, I'm dusting the relevant areas, and when I saw where I was supposed to be dusting, I was like, that doesn't make any sense at all. In terms of the story, Spirit of Justice does a great job of continuing where Dual Destinies left off and giving Apollo even more development so that he truly feels like he's his own character, has completely redeemed himself from the missteps of Apollo Justice, and you can actually be proud of what he's accomplished and feel like he really is of the same caliber as Phoenix was at the end of the original trilogy. Unfortunately, the characterization of the female leads seems to be a bit of a misstep. Athena seems to take a backseat in the narration, with most of her development being done in Dual Destinies, and she's more or less relegated to a sidekick this time around. When this game first came out, one of the big marketing gimmicks was that it said that Maya Fey would be making her grand return for the first time since Trials and Tribulations, if you don't count Professor Layton versus Phoenix Wright. And while it is great to see her again, and she feels like she's more mature, while at the same time feeling like, yep, it's the same old Maya, the game really underutilizes her full potential. I don't want to spoil how it's done, but it really feels like a major blunder. Thankfully, the special episode more than makes up for that fact, and as a whole includes lots of amazing Ace Attorney fan service, but it is really a shame how she was treated in the main game. Why is it that the peppy female sidekicks are all just cast to the side? Setting aside my gripes of the way that the characters are sometimes treated, Spirit of Justice is my favorite out of the three because it has such a strong narrative, especially with the Hall of Justice bringing back some of that intensity that the Witch's Court did in Professor Layton vs. Phoenix Wright. It makes the best use out of the 3DS's engine by having the full 3D videos in the seances, as well as more 3D cutscenes instead of the anime cutscenes, so you'll often see the characters in full body animations because the developers were concerned that players only perceived the characters as floating torsos because of the witness stand and the defense and prosecution benches. The game has a wonderful conclusion and feels like a perfect finale to Apollo's story, and leaves enough open to the imagination that you can slightly get an idea of where the next Ace Attorney game might go if Capcom decides to continue the series. As for my verdict of the collection as a whole, I think this is spectacular. The orchestra pieces alone make it worth a purchase. And $50 may seem like it's only a little bit cheaper than what Nintendo offers for their games. You are getting 3 full-length games, and they're all preserved really nicely, and most of them are really incredible games at that, along with so many extra features, makes this actually kind of a steal of a price. If you love Ace Attorney, then you are really going to love the Apollo Justice trilogy. But as for in what order you should play it, I suggest you play the original trilogy first and then get into this. It doesn't really matter when you play Great Ace Attorney Chronicles because that's more of its own game, so just decide when to play that whenever you want. But it is really great that all of the mainline Ace Attorney games are now on the Switch, if you don't count Professor Layton vs. Phoenix Wright. I do! If you don't want to spend the full price, this does have a physical version, so you can rent it, which might help for players that don't like the linear nature of the storylines and might just want to experience it once and get it over with. So I highly recommend this trilogy, even if you've already played this games. The additional orchestra pieces and the extra artwork might make it worth it, as well as being able to see it on the big screen and view the games as they would have probably been if they were not constrained to the DS and the 3DS. So with that, thank you very much for watching. Please let me know down in the comments if you have any questions or concerns or critiques, what you think of the video. If you've been an Ace Attorney fan, let me know. I love reading and responding to all of my comments. Special thanks to my patrons, Matthew Rakowski, Spoon Ghost, and Splatcat for their continued financial assistance. And until the next time, remember to keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye!